Good morning, everybody. We are excited to have you back for the second day of the APAICS Tech Summit. My name is Butch Fry. I'm a consultant with APAICS, and we are excited to have four great panels today. To kick off our day of speakers, we are going to have some comments from Neha Joshi of Accenture. Neha is Accenture's Securities Growth and Strategy Lead with responsibility for driving growth of global cybersecurity business through strategic investments, acquisitions, and innovation programs. Neha also serves as the Security Innovation Organization, oversees the Security Innovation Organization, which harvests new technology ideas from across the practice and invests in partnerships with clients to build them out to scale. Neha has a proven track record of almost 2 decades of experience in the security industry. She has authored numerous industry articles and co-authored a book on innovation in identity and access management. She is also a frequent speaker on topics including cybersecurity, innovation, and leadership. We're excited to have her introduce this privacy panel.
Thank you, APAICS, for the opportunity to address your 2021 Tech Summit on the important topic of tech privacy. You brought together an impressive group of speakers over these 2 days, and Accenture is proud to be a part of it. My name is Neha Joshi, Managing Director of Growth and Strategy for Accenture Security. I lead the business strategy and development of innovations for Accenture Security's 8,000 security specialists around the globe, who help companies become more resilient in the face of cybersecurity threats. 70% of Americans believe that their personal data is less secure than it was 5 years ago. Privacy is a complex problem that the federal government and private industry must partner together to address on behalf of those Americans. Today, technology is evolving faster than ever, and the pace is only increasing. As part of our daily lives, we use dozens of digital services. And in doing so, we voluntarily hand over troves of our personal information to businesses. Often, we provide our information to companies without even realizing it, and authorize companies to use that information in ways we hadn't fully considered. At the same time, cybercrime continues to rise, and a new elevated threat has emerged that is having crippling effects in almost every industry. Hackers are stealing personal information and extorting businesses, their employees, and their customers. Accenture's Cyber Investigations, Forensics, and Response team observed a 160% increase in ransomware events in 2020 compared to the year before. In the first half of 2021, the number of those attacks increased another 125%. So we are likely going to see a 3-fold increase in ransomware events in just the span of 2 years. In addition, ransomware actors aren't just locking up computers anymore. They are threatening to publicly release the private data they stole, and in some cases are releasing it, publicly exposing proprietary and sensitive data of organizations and their customers. This new trend adds even more complications to board-level decisions about how to respond to and recover from these incidents. In sum, our personal data is more vulnerable than ever. It's no wonder that 81% of Americans believe that they have very little or no control over the data companies collect. This lack of trust will be a significant inhibitor to America's economic recovery. We have recently reached an inflection point. In the absence of a federal law, we are now seeing both state governments and federal agencies begin to impose security and privacy requirements of their own. Examples of this range from the California privacy law that was enacted in 2018, the Biden executive order on cybersecurity that imposes significant requirements on federal contractors, and now we are anticipating both the Federal Trade Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission to begin rulemakings on consumer privacy and cybersecurity, respectively. While these are steps in the right direction, complying with varied regulations and requirements is more complicated for companies and does not provide comprehensive protections. At Accenture, our CEO, Julie Sweet, has long called for the passage of a national privacy law that would establish strong privacy protections for consumers and provide adequate enforcement so that businesses will be accountable for meeting those requirements. In fact, many CEOs have been calling for this since 2018, when the Business Roundtable released a detailed framework for privacy legislation. With or without a national privacy law, there is clearly a need for companies to invest time and resources heavily in cybersecurity and privacy protections. C-suite leaders must understand, monitor, and then act to proactively ensure resilience of their security and privacy programs. We know that our partners like APAICS are critical to the success of our efforts, and we appreciate them convening this discussion and inviting Accenture Security to share our thoughts. I look forward to hearing the rest of the session and further discussing this important topic.
Thank you, Neha. We also have remarks from Congressman Mark Takano this morning. Congressman Takano represents the 41st District of California, which includes the people of Riverside, Moreno Valley, Jurupa Valley, and Paris. Prior to Congress, Representative Takano served as a teacher and educator in Riverside, also leading up the Board of Regents at Riverside Community College. In 2012, Congressman Takano became the first openly gay person of color elected to Congress. He now serves as the chairman on the House Committee of Veterans Affairs and as a member of the Education and Labor Committee. We are excited to hear from Congressman Takano this morning.
Hello, I'm Congressman Mark Takano, and I represent California's 41st Congressional District. I also serve as second vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. I want to thank you all for inviting me to the 2021 APAICS Tech Summit. I'm honored to join you, and I'm proud to represent a community that values the advance in technology by creating an opportunity for research and discussion. While sadly we cannot be together in person, I'm glad we can still come together virtually to discuss the importance of tech privacy. In the last year, the coronavirus pandemic exemplified how necessary technology is to support our evolving communities. Technology allowed us to explore telework and telehealth options, enabled virtual learning in our schools, and facilitated our connection with family and friends while we sheltered at home. Despite the difficulties that we lived through over the past 19 months, technology brought us together. The truth is that now more than ever, our communities are incredibly dependent on technology, and because of that, it is important that we safeguard personal and classified data. The need to establish more robust data privacy is becoming increasingly necessary with the integration of more technology into our daily lives. As more apps and internet programs become part of our routines, more tech companies gain raw, unprotected access to our personal information and behavior online. Cyber attacks and ransomware force us to take a closer, more critical look at our tech dependence and its impact on our communities. We've seen how misinformation and anti-Asian rhetoric on social media platforms has fostered hate and violent attacks on the AAPI community. The pandemic intensified xenophobia and scapegoating toward Asian Americans. Our growing rivalry with the People's Republic of China and our legitimate concern about President Xi Jinping's growing authoritarianism unfortunately leads to unfounded suspicion of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. We must stand opposed to bigotry that conflates the actions of the Chinese government with Chinese Americans, and at the same time reduce our vulnerability to data breaches and aggression authored by the Chinese government. Where this leaves us now is with an urgent need to establish a regulatory framework centered around data privacy and security, and set minimum standards that will protect consumers and critical infrastructure alike. We must ensure that the adoption of new technological platforms protects our most sensitive and personal information. Now, I know that our country is at a turning point, and the investments we make today, like attending this APAICS Tech Summit, matter. By taking action to understand the importance of data privacy, we can stay one step ahead. I applaud all of you for being a part of this summit and for echoing the importance of privacy and technology in our world today. With that, I thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you, Congressman Takano. We are excited to dive into this topic. With us today, we have two great subject matter experts. We have Professor Laura Moy from Georgetown and John Yang, the leader of AAJC. Professor Moy is the director of Georgetown Law's Communication and Technology Law Clinic, where she and a team of staff attorneys and law students represent nonprofit organizations in a range of technology policy matters before the federal agencies. She's also the associate director of the Center on Privacy and Technology, a small think tank at the law school which conducts research and advocacy on issues that at the intersection of technology and civil rights. As a policy expert, Professor Moy has written and spoken before agencies and Congress on consumer privacy rights, law enforcement surveillance, data security, device portability, copyright, and net neutrality. John Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. At AAJC, John leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy, advocacy, education, and litigation. His extensive legal background enables AAJC to address systemic policies, programs, and legislative attempts to discriminate against and marginalize Asian American Pacific Islanders and other minority communities. John is an experienced attorney with over 2 decades of policy and litigation and corporate expertise. He served in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he was the principal advisor to Secretary Penny Pritzker on issues related to Asia, and worked with the White House and other U.S. agencies on strategic and economic issues concerning the region. Welcome to you both. We're really excited to have you both here, and it should be an exciting discussion today. A lot has been in the news the last couple of weeks. We had the Facebook files. We had some testimony on the Hill. We would love to kind of dive into these issues. John, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the key issues in consumer data, online privacy, and cybersecurity that are most pressing in this era of big tech?
Thanks for that, Butch. Wonderful to be here. Thank you all for tuning in and talking about this topic. And actually, I might start by just asking the meta question as the key issue, which is how comfortable are we with respect to business models that really drive sort of consumer data as the way that they generate revenue, with both respect to advertising as well as other things. And those business models that advertising revenue in part hinges on the ability to micro-target specific communities. Because I think that's one of the fundamental questions that we're trying to grapple with here. Like, we all recognize that having data for some of these companies and government, certainly government organizations, has great value, whether it's to pay bills, whether it's for banking, whether it's to buy things, even like getting through airport security. There's a number of things for which we would willingly give up some of our data. It creates great convenience for us. But the flip side of this is we are absolutely seeing how this is harming all of our communities, and in so many different ways. And I know we're going to get into a lot more detail about all of this. But so I think that's one of the fundamental questions that we ask. And then underneath that, the two questions that occur to me as we go through all of this. One is, all right, regardless of the fundamental question, what are the responsibilities, either under law or just as a business ethic, that companies have in addressing these issues? And then two is, what are the recourses that are available to consumers if there are breaches, if there are concerns that they have about revealing that data? So I would frame it in terms of those three big buckets and then delve into it from there.
That's awesome. I mean, you do lay out the problem succinctly there. It is a big problem. We are constantly giving over our data to these tech companies. So, I mean, Professor Moy, how much of our consumer data is out there, and how worried should we be about it? I mean, it is obviously impacting multiple levels of society. Facebook's own research is reporting this now. I mean, what is the level of concern that you think regular consumers should have on a daily basis?
Consumers are extremely concerned. I agree with everything that John just said, and I'll just highlight some statistics from research done by Pew, finding that 81% of Americans feel that the potential risks of companies collecting data about them outweigh the benefits. 81%. Almost 70% are not confident that companies will use their personal information in ways that they'll be comfortable with. And almost 80% believe that if companies misuse or compromise personal information, they won't admit mistakes and take responsibility. So setting aside for a moment your question about whether they should be very concerned, consumers are extremely concerned about this. And then to your question about how much data about us is out there, I think, so to some extent, it's unknown and unknowable. But consider that we virtually all carry around mobile devices now with us everywhere that we go. And our mobile devices themselves are collecting information about what we're doing and where we're going. The apps that we're using are collecting information. Advertisers who are operating on platforms and through applications are collecting data. And then data brokers are often sucking up as much data as they can and repackaging it and selling it. So our data ecosystem is extremely leaky right now. And as John says, this is leading to, this data collection is really occurring to drive business models that then are causing further harms to society. And so I think, looking broader than just are consumers concerned about privacy per se, to what consumers are saying about data-related harms, consumers are really concerned about things like micro-targeted ads, right? That oftentimes may be discriminatory. They're really concerned about things like amplification of hate speech and misinformation and disinformation online. They're really concerned about increasing political polarization. And all of these things are privacy-related harms driven by the very business models that John is talking about.
Absolutely, and we will dig into some of that algorithmic discussion in a little bit. But John, before we get into that, you laid out two great, secondary questions here, which what are responsibilities for the companies? Professor Moy mentioned this, that, consumers do not trust companies to admit their mistakes. So what responsibilities do these companies have? And moreover, what recourses do consumers have once their data is used? How can we find out whether or not our data is being used and how it's being used?
Yeah, and I think this is a very much an evolving field. And frankly, I think Professor Moy in some ways is probably better equipped to talk about some of this than I am. But what I look at with respect to the responsibilities of companies, number one is, I know the Accenture person talked about federal regulation. I do think that federal legislation is necessary, because right now we have a patchwork scheme. Who enforces even the existing laws is unclear, as between the FCC, FTC, to a certain extent, DOJ plays a role as well. So to think about sort of how to integrate all of that, I think is very, very important. Part of this is about transparency, making sure that the companies really put in plain English what they are doing with that data, right? And that English that is understandable. Now, notice I do say English, specifically representing a civil rights organization that represents the Asian American community. Part of that, though, is also making sure that translations are available, and not over-the-top translations through Google or Google Translate or the like, because we know that those are inaccurate. But even the problem with all of that is that you could have it in plain English, but the reality is that most consumers won't really sort of understand that, and they will just click through it, right? So then thinking about, okay, what are the remedies? And whether it is private causes of action, whether it is having ombudsman or someone that really can sort of have some enforcement ability with respect to violations. I think those are certainly parts of the solution. The other thing that I kind of think about, and I don't know if Professor Moy could, sort of has data on this, is, the question also is, what do we as consumers do? Because 81% of us don't trust that companies are going to do the right thing, or don't trust how our information is being used.
Right.
But my guess is that the large percentage of us still give out our information, again, whether it is to do banking, to pay bills, or the like. And so how do we square those two things? Is this notion of, okay, we believe in its convenience, so we don't want to give up the convenience, but we don't trust it. So what does that mean in terms of what laws will actually work to protect us better when we willingly engage in some of that behavior?
Absolutely. Professor Moy, you are the expert here. You have a lot of data on this. We love carrying around. I mean, I have it right in front of me today. My cell phone stays with me 24/7, 365. What are the responsibilities for companies, and what are the responsibilities for consumers when we go about giving our data away and the companies using these data?
Yeah, I think so. This is a great topic and a great line of questions, because there is this real disconnect, or we see this disconnect between consumer behavior and consumer concerns. But when you drill down, you find that what consumers are saying about this is not that they don't actually care about privacy, that they're saying one thing but doing another. It's more that they are feeling resigned about the current state of data collection and data use. That they find that when faced with just, for example, greater transparency and supposed choice, what that actually looks like is privacy policies that are too long and too complex for the average consumer to read, right? Research has shown, looking at the length of privacy policies, that if people read the actual policies for every service that they're using, that they would spend more time actually reading policies than they do going online, which is a lot because people spend a lot of time online. So, I think consumers are feeling resigned to the current state of affairs. Now, on the question of what obligation or kind of what responsibilities companies have to engage in perhaps ethical uses or to protect consumers' privacy, I think that more and more we are recognizing that the obligations incumbent upon companies go beyond merely collecting information in a way that is transparent and using it using it and storing it in ways that are secure, to ensuring that consumer information is also used in ways that are actually ethical, right? And that are not harmful, particularly when those harms might be falling disproportionately on historically disadvantaged communities and minorities. And so, this I think that this is a real turning point in conversations about privacy, where we are starting to move from a framework where folks said, okay, yeah, we want companies to be transparent about what they're doing, we want them to collect information and store it securely, to saying, okay, no, I think we want companies also to project how the consumer information is going to be used, and whether harms are going to flow from it, not just to individuals, but to society as a whole, right? And that goes back to the things that I was talking about before, things like discriminatory advertising and hate speech and misinformation and disinformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's dig into that a little bit. I mean, we've heard a lot about algorithms over the past couple of weeks. I mean, we've heard about it the past couple of years, but I think Americans are just starting to wrap their heads around how these algorithms actually work and how they may play in to some of these harms that Professor Moy and John have been talking about. John, tell me a little bit from a layman's perspective. How do these algorithms actually work? To discriminate against folks, to really cause some social harms, and what are some of these social harms that these algorithms are causing?
Sure. So let's use a couple of different examples. One may be facial surveillance, right? All of us are aware of sort of algorithms that try to identify faces try to identify certain features and perhaps link them to an individual, link them to personal information about that individual. Now, we also know, based on a lot of research that has done, is that facial recognition software thus far, the darker your skin color, the more likely it is for that to be inaccurate. And so that has a tremendous effect on communities of color in terms of being misidentified, which from a consumer perspective is poor, but then from a law enforcement perspective has a huge social impact. So if you think about whether it's in the criminal justice space, I think about it with respect to an Asian organization within the South Asian AMEMSA community, the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American communities. Those communities have suffered disproportionately because they have been misidentified, because there is this software that is being used that sort of places an extra burden on them. Then you also think about software that predicts where crimes occur. That's something that law enforcement has been using, or some have used it. That's an area where a number of organizations have tried to push back and get them not to use this type of software. The problem with this software is that in order to predict where crimes occur, you need a data set to determine, well, where have crimes occurred in the past, on the theory that data set will help you predict the future. But the problem is, if that past data is flawed, it goes to the age-old expression that we've always understood: garbage in, garbage out, right? And so if you have garbage data going in, data that is frankly racially biased, then you're going to get racially biased data going out. Specifically, that data will show that they think that there's more crime occurring in an African American or Latino community. And as a result, the police will spend more time patrolling those areas. And, just like with speeding, if you stay in one place long enough, you'll probably catch someone that's speeding. That doesn't mean that one place has more speeders, but because you've placed a police officer there, that's where you're going to catch them. And so that's what happens in these communities too. You put more law enforcement, disproportionate amount of law enforcement in a particular community, then you get a disproportionate arrest rate, and all of a sudden your data confirms that this is where you should be. So those are two very specific examples of how some of this data gets weaponized against communities of color and some of the harm that we are seeing in our communities.
Professor Moy, John gave very real world examples how these things can be used for nefarious ends. Can you talk a little bit about, how, it might not even be that direct, that how sometimes some of these ads that come up through the algorithms might just reinforce pre-existing biases and therefore cause real world harm?
Yeah, absolutely. So John gave some really great examples. And I'd also mention research by a computer scientist named LaTanya Sweeney, who did, she found through a personal experience of hers that searches for characteristically Black names on Google were more likely to turn up sponsored search results advertising the existence of arrest records. Regardless of whether or not arrest records actually existed for an individual, those ads from data brokers that consumers can purchase information from directly, their ads showed up. And that is likely because consumers using the platform were more likely to click on those search results when they were searching for characteristically Black names. So this is going to John's point that you have a garbage in, garbage out problem where algorithms may reinforce past biases. So that taking that into the advertising context, in addition, these platforms that distribute content in a way that is algorithmically curated for us, they do so in a way that is designed to maximize engagement with content, right? So they will show you content that they calculate you are more likely to read, to click on, to like, to share with others. And that makes sense. They have to do that because by keeping people engaged on a platform, they keep people viewing ads for longer on a platform, and that's how they make their money. But the problem is that when content online relates to things that we talked about before, or when it includes ads for things like jobs and credit or housing, then those ads might be prioritized to certain audiences based on predictions about what particular audiences are likely to click on. So just to provide a concrete example here, research published in 2019 by a team showed that even when advertisers didn't specify a demographic audience for their ads, putting those ads on one of these platforms that had a data-driven advertising engine resulted in those ads being displayed for jobs in the lumber industry to an audience that was 72% white and 90% men, or for supermarket cashier positions shown to 85% women, jobs with taxi companies to 75% Black users. So when you think about this and extrapolate from this, it raises a bunch of questions. What are people likely to click on when they search for characteristically Asian names? Or what ads are people who are part of the Asian community more likely to click on? And how might that actually kind of cabin the opportunities that are available to other people who consider themselves part of the community? And these are really critical questions that I think are part of the privacy debate.
Yeah, if I could add one other thing, I think those are excellent points. To carry this a little bit further is in the sort of, whether it's a consumer space or frankly the mental health space. So some of the effects of all of these algorithms. I mean, you've seen some of that discussion on regarding Facebook, right? And the effect on teen girls. Let's extrapolate that out a little bit. If you put in a search term, let's say successful people, or a search term, say beauty, what are the images that come up with that search term? And I think there are studies that have shown that those images are predominantly Caucasian, blonde hair, blue eyes, and it reinforces this image that that's what all of us should aspire to. So for us in the communities of color, we see that, and that has a certain stigmatizing effect, certain mental health effect on all of us, right? In terms of, okay, well, we don't belong. We are not beautiful people. We are not successful people. So, when we talk about all of the pernicious aspects of these algorithms, that's another one that I want to add in there. This goes to what Professor Moy is saying. Some of the, I can't remember the exact words you used, but some of the softer concerns. It's not even the hard criminal concerns that right. I talked about. It's those softer concerns that affect all of us as human beings as well.
Absolutely. And, even to build upon that, we have heard a lot about particularly during the period of COVID, the spread of misinformation, disinformation online. Professor Moore, can you talk a little bit about what your research has found on some of these issues of the spread of misinformation through these platforms, through the algorithms, and how it really can have devastating effects on the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also say, I'm happy to talk a little bit about what I know on this topic, but there are some folks who are doing the real empirical research on this, like Joan Donovan, who are just real experts. And so just to kind of humbly say, I'm happy to talk about this, but not my research directly. I think that as I was saying before, there's this real problem of when you have algorithms that target content based on predictions of what folks are likely to engage with, then they're going to target content, or they're going to prioritize content that is incendiary, right? Or that is provocative, and that is likely to contravene people's expectations or surprise them in some way. And that is often going to include content that includes fringe viewpoints, right? Or even things that are straight up fabrications. And there are some parties that have actually intentionally taken advantage of this fact to just generate content for the purpose of getting clicks and being able to distribute sponsored content with greater efficiency. And so, these very algorithms are in large part responsible for the misinformation and disinformation that we see online. And I think that it is also known that that a lot of the content that is misinformation and disinformation online is kind of more likely to be interesting to people who are undecided on what they think about something, right? And people who, for whatever reason, have had a hard time grappling with the science on COVID, for example, or on vaccines, might find content about that is anti-vax, or content claiming that the pandemic is a scam, right? They might find that content more provocative and be more likely to click on it. And as a result, that content really ends up, again, kind of in consistent with the intention of the algorithms, might end up finding the audience that is most susceptible to the viewpoints being espoused in the content. And and it's really just all part of the same. And if I can I just want to also just point out that some of this may already, when we talk about the responsibility of companies, some of this may already be unlawful in lots of contexts. And yes, we do need new laws on these issues, but in addition, we also may need more resources for some of our existing law enforcers, state attorneys general and the Federal Trade Commission, right? Or entities that already have some jurisdiction here, but really lack the resources to police the entire internet. It's just very difficult, a really big problem.
Yeah, I want to get back to those enforcement issues here in a minute. But John, can you talk a little bit about how this misinformation, this disinformation has really impacted the API community and other communities of colors, and some of the discriminatory effects that have been seen through these algorithms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the attacks on Asian Americans, the anti-Asian hate that we've seen in the last 2 years, a lot of it is attributable to misinformation, disinformation. Now, at the very outset, there was a question about how COVID-19 started. The question of did it emanate from China? Did it emanate from animals that jumped over to humans? Some of those are legitimate questions. Don't get me wrong about that. But the problem with misinformation, disinformation is that it is such a quick jump from, it might have been started, it might have been resident in bats, to Asian Americans eating bats, right? I mean, literally that was a jump that took place over the course of just a few days. And then we saw that circulate virally on the internet, to the point that you had senators even making that statement on the floor of the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is the danger of all of this. I think part of this also, to Professor Moy's point, that's kind of interesting to me, is like, part of this is there's always been fringe theories out there. There's always been conspiracy theories out there. That's always been the case. But the problem with these platforms, right, and the problem with this ecosystem that we now have, is that it's easier to find those, and some of these algorithms drive you towards these on the theory that we should be presenting alternative theories, right? Where this isn't really an alternative theory. It's one thing to sort of debate about issues for which there are legitimate debate, right? But when you start debating science, right, when you start debating whether Biden won the election, that takes it into a different realm. And that's where, again, I do think that platforms, content providers, do have a responsibility to understand it's not about free speech anymore, right? It's about something different. So I think those are certainly within the Asian American community. We saw that very directly. Now, on the flip side, I want to be very clear about this as well. Frankly, we're also responsible for some misinformation. And especially since I'm speaking to an audience that probably is largely Asian American, one piece that I want to really call out is there have been sort of innumerable number of videos that have gone around on our different feeds showing African Americans attacking Asian Americans as part of this anti-Asian hate. And again, did that happen? Yes. But let's be clear about what the statistics are. The statistics are that only about, according to one study by the University of Michigan, about 5% of those attacks against Asian Americans were from African Americans or the African American community. Another study that was done by NIH suggested about 75% of the attacks against Asian Americans were by Caucasians. So although there are those videos around, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're informed about what the actual statistics are. Because what ended up happening within our communities, and I heard this, was that, why are the African Americans attacking us? Well, that's just wrong. And we need to call that out too and say, that's not the facts. Here are the real facts. So again, we do have a responsibility and a role to play in all of this, and being careful to monitor for ourselves what the real facts are before we disseminate them.
That's a very good point. And I want to deal with both of those things, enforcement mechanisms and norms we should build moving forward. Before we get to that, I want to encourage the audience, whoever's listening, to submit some questions for these two speakers. You can do it through YouTube and Facebook. We will try to get them to answer a question or two before we're all over. But let's circle back to the original two questions. Professor Boyd, what does an enforcement or regulatory regime look like over some of these issues, and how do we really put teeth behind and what resources are needed behind the pre-existing structures that we have, and what do we need to build out moving forward over the next couple of years to really make sure we're able to tackle these problems? It seems now senators actually know what an algorithm is and know how to question, Facebook folks. But what is the next step moving forward? What do we need as a government, both on the state and local level, to really make sure some of these privacy issues are met?
Great. Yeah, so if I can just start, I just want to make sure to really explicitly tie this back to privacy, right? Because all of this targeting that we're talking about, this is all driven by consumer data. It's driven by the consumer data that is collected when we patronize these platforms. It's driven by the consumer data that we share through our mobile devices, through our use of apps, especially that include advertising on them by third-party advertisers that are collecting information. And so, so all of this kind of like data that's floating around in what is essentially the Wild West is driving a lot of these larger problems. So one solution is to actually crack down on privacy protections, right? To actually limit the amount of information that is collected about consumers, and to put in place things that look like purpose specification and use limitation. In other words, requiring entities to state on the front end what they plan to use consumer data for, and then limiting their use to only that purpose for which it was collected, and require them to minimize the amount of data that they maintain over time, actually delete it when they're not using it anymore for the purpose that it was originally collected for, that kind of thing. I think also we may need tighter restrictions in place, tighter privacy restrictions in place for entities that provide services that are truly unavoidable for people, right? I mean, there has long been this thinking that, oh, well, consumers can just vote with their feet, right? If they don't like the privacy practices of a company, they just, they vote with their feet or their wallet, they'll patronize another service. And that's increasingly not a possibility for a lot of consumers in certain contexts, right? So for example, when it comes to data that is collected by your internet service provider about you, most people have no choice but to have an internet service provider and share information with it any more than they have a choice about subscribing to phone service. And the same may be true for certain, tech giants that people find increasingly impossible to avoid online. It's really hard to avoid advertising and the data collection that is driving it by some of the really large platforms. Sometimes people's employers require them to engage on certain platforms for their job. And sometimes even looking for a job, people feel like they have to have a profile with some of the major platforms in order to even be considered for a job, because otherwise they seem like weirdos for not having an online presence. That's the reality that we're moving into. But then more specifically, I think it's really important that if we are talking about privacy law, and I absolutely think we should have some new privacy laws, that those privacy laws should directly include civil rights protections. Protections like prohibitions on discriminatory advertising. And again, some of those things might already be unlawful, but making it crystal clear that our civil rights laws extend to the online spaces that we inhibit and the information that we're sharing about ourselves online. And then finally, on this question of what other resources we need out there, well, right now there is a proposal before Congress to provide the Federal Trade Commission with an additional $1 billion of funding. That would be really critical and important in this context. The FTC is supposed to police the entire US economy. That includes the internet. And right now it only has, I think, between 40 and 50 people working in the division of privacy and identity protection. That's not enough, right? I mean, many of their counterparts in the EU have hundreds of people working on these issues. If we want to keep up with the rest of the world, we need similar resources here.
Makes sense. Hey, John, I'm going to take us out of the weeds of the law, and you represent a civil rights organization, but you also represent an organization that's focused on civic society. And, really what we're talking about here is a lot of these algorithms, a lot of data usage spring out the worst of us. One of my favorite quotes is E.B. White quote that democracy is the score at the beginning of the night. And I think what that means to me is, we have a common truth, a common thing that we're all cheering for, and some common baselines. How do we get back to that? A common truth where we wake up and we read the same newspaper every day, and we could talk to one another. We may have disagreements, but we have a shared reality. I think a lot of this has driven us away into our preconceived notions. I know at AAJC, you all are focused on this. Obviously, you're focused on a large amount of legal issues, civil rights issues, but this has got to be your main driving focus every day you get up, is it not?
It is, and if I had an easy solution, then I probably would be doing something different. Unfortunately, I think this is an all of society thing. And number one is to recognize the problem. I think we're all beginning to recognize the problem and understand the scope of it, right? Because Professor Moy talked about this at the very outset. It's like it's infecting all of us. It's causing all of us to be in silos so that we're just talking to ourselves, so to speak, right? And the fact that these algorithms are it's literally like 4 clicks away from going from Fox News to One America to the Daily Stormer to 4chan or something along those lines. We have to number one is, as consumers, I think we need to be much smarter about this, become better educated about how we're consuming information online. And I know we're getting away from privacy a little bit, but part of this does go to what Professor Moy talked about, is all of it relates to privacy, is that in the sense that the more information we give, and we give it just unknowingly or without question, the more data that these companies will have at their disposal to micro-target us, right? So we have to recognize that. Not to say that that doesn't mean we don't engage, but we have to recognize that that's part of the system. And then we have to recognize, right, as consumers, it's like, okay, when I'm clicking on things, how do I get at a more common truth, right? And this is where we really have to, I think, sort of approach it, I call it from a retail standpoint. And what I mean by that is, look, we as AAJC, as an organization, as a nonprofit, we're not going to be able to convince, a particular individual in Nebraska necessarily that they should stop watching One America. I'm not going to be able to do that. But what we can do is, can we create a network so that someone can have a conversation with them and say, hey, there's a different reality that's out there, right? Because I don't blame that person in Nebraska for believing something, and I don't mean to pick on Nebraska. But if all they're watching is One America, that's going to be their reality. So how do we break that cycle? So there's the consumer aspect, but perhaps even more importantly, again, I think businesses have a role to play. The platforms have a role to play. Is, they have a great deal of responsibility. Yes, they have a lot of power. Who was it? This comes from a movie, I think, is with great power comes great responsibility. I think that's Spider-Man, now that I think about it. But it's true. It's true. And they have to recognize that. And they can't just simply say, well, you guys figure out a regulation, we'll abide by the regulation. Frankly, that's not enough. That's not enough to just say, you guys make the laws and we'll follow the laws. As a business, you have a greater ethical obligation than that, right? And then, yes, Congress has a role to play as well. And it's a multifaceted role. I think Professor Moy hit upon some of the aspects of it. There's one piece of legislation that was introduced by Senator Markey and Representative Matsui that addresses some of these pieces that I think is a very good starting point for a number of the pieces that we've been talking about, and really thinking about it a little bit more holistically. but there has to be work done. And that includes members of Congress getting educated. Frankly, at these hearings, sometimes, as we all know, unfortunately, the members of Congress get turned around on the technology, right? Yeah. And so that the CEOs, the individuals testifying, frankly, can run circles around people. And maybe the people testifying, and I'm going to be big pictured about, maybe they're not trying to run circles around the members of Congress, but they just talk in a way that our members of Congress aren't up to speed on yet, right? So really getting that education piece as well is going to be important.
That is a good point. The thing we don't have any questions yet, but the thing I may want to end on is what can the folks, and this is to you both, what can the folks at home do to, both protect themselves going forward, but also to help, with some of the fixes of these issues? Professor Moy, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. So I would make sure that when folks are talking to their elected representatives about privacy issues, or when they are working for elected representatives on privacy issues, that they really do advocate for solutions that include civil rights protections, direct civil rights protections. I would also encourage support for journalism. And that's something that I think we haven't really talked about in this conversation. But one of the problems with our current information ecosystem is that we have departed from a model where folks got their information from the 7 o'clock news, and that information pertained to the viewpoints, many different viewpoints of the people within their geographic region, to a model where people increasingly are living in the filter bubble. And that's unfortunate. And, so to the extent that we can support alternative models to people getting their information from these particular single sources that espouse a single viewpoint, I think that that's really important here. I agree with John that it is incumbent on all of us to be more knowledgeable about how information about us is being collected and used, and to make conscious decisions accordingly. And I think that I think that part of that might include not patronizing services that we view as particularly harmful. I think it also might include using some of the legal resources that are out there and are available to us to gather some information about what's actually happening. So, under the California law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, folks can now get access to copies of the information that is being collected about them by companies that are subject to CCPA. And there are other attempts to do that in other states as well, to create access rights. And when those access rights exist, folks should use them. That also exists under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. People can find out what information has been collected about their children by using the access provision in COPPA. And so, I just would encourage folks to think about this broadly, get educated, and learn more using every tool at their disposal.
Awesome. I heard a lot about Timothy Snyder's recommendations come through there from On Tyranny. John, how about you?
Yeah, I might add on to all of those excellent recommendations. Number one is retweet, post articles by Professor Moy and others doing the research, right?
There you go. Because
again, sort of the more we all get educated about what the real pernicious effects are of some of this, the better educated we become. And we're using that, I purposely say it that way, because we are then using that tool that we know has affected all of us to our advantage, right? Because we need to become better educated. And if that sort of, the more we get that out into the ecosystem, the more that will help. At a very practical level, think about what you are retweeting or reposting, right? Do you really need to do that? Because what you are potentially doing as a consumer is feeding into that ecosystem. Because as she said, they're looking for us to sort of, for the sensational news, because they see that we react to it. So if we are instead reacting to things that are more objective, again, like studies, more objective journalism, true journalism. If that's what we're promoting instead of some of the more sensationalist pieces, then we're starting to create a better ecosystem. I know that feels small and perhaps insufficient, but I do think it's also necessary, right? It's necessary for all of us to take those steps if we are to create the ecosystem that we want.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I want to thank both of our panelists. This has been a great discussion. It's been a part of a great 2 days of panels, and I encourage everybody to tune in at 12:45. We will have 2 fireside chats with Albert Chang of Amazon Studios and Jay Trinidad with Disney, talk about the world of content. But thank you again to both John Yang and Professor Laura Moy. We appreciate your expertise and giving us a lot to think about this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.